Hi everyone, this is Jason speaking. This is part two of our AI double episode. If you haven't listened to part one, you might want to go and do that first as it gives a little bit of context on what we're speaking about. AI and safety is the theme of the day. If not, we have tried to clip this so you can listen to it standalone. Hopefully you will enjoy the episode. Maybe to switch tangents a little bit, or to switch to a different topic, what's your thoughts on, I know OpenAI has just released memory as like a feature. What is your thoughts on having an AI that remembers everything that you've just ever spoken to it?
So that's actually a really interesting one in that I've been predominantly using Grok for my chat-based AI stuff, and I always use it in that little private mode where it doesn't have a
Mm.
memory, where it only remembers just that chat, and as soon as that chat ends, it disappears. Whether that's actually happening under the hood is possible. I don't know. I don't trust XAI. They just happen to have a model that I do like to use. Um, and the thing is that people use these tools like therapists, like doctors, technically it doesn't give out, medical advice, but it gives out medical advice. And so if you see the chat history of someone, you get a very intimate insight into that person. Right. It's like you can see that they were wondering about how to get rid of the goobies that was growing between their toes, and that they're having relationship troubles, and that they don't know how to convert an integer to a string. Um, and so I personally dislike the idea of memory just based purely on the fact that most people do not have the digital hygiene to keep what is essentially the most intimate thing that they can have safe. Um, what are your thoughts?
What it reminds me of is the reason why Google is better than Facebook in when it comes to understanding its users. The argument goes is that with Facebook, you go there, you spend time on the site, and it needs to infer information about you. Whereas on Google, you just put in what you want into that chat box or into that search box and ask for it. So when it comes to ads and targeting, Google kind of knows what you want, and Facebook is trying to infer what you want. And
Mm.
so that's why it's a bit of a harder problem for Facebook to figure out your personality is to give those ads. If you look at ChatGPT and these AIs, it's almost like not just what you want, but everything about you. Like people, as you said, people are using it as therapists. They're using it to ask questions throughout their day. They're using it as part of their work. And what I'm worried about is that it's going to be very easy to just start with like, oh, and I add free tier where you have ads. Suddenly, it's
Mm.
starting to recommend stuff based on your very intimate, personal conversations that you have with it. Um, and I mean, this goes back into like whether we think advertising is good or bad. And we like to think that OpenAI is this very good company that's gonna like look after the values of people, but Google, it's not beyond them that they're going to want to put some sort of ad or monetization into this. And
That's what they do
maybe it will
best.
be maybe it will be that the pay per user per seat model will be the only way to access it. But I don't, I mean, seeing inside of these big companies, like there's going to be a point where someone's going to say, oh, why don't we serve some ads to these guys that we can lower the costs, and everyone wins.
Yep, and it's like personal ads, but on the next level.
Exactly. And also, as you rightly pointed out, it's, I mean, first of all, you could just have opt out or opt in, opt out kind of toggle button, like private mode, non private mode, like you do in a browser. But back to what we were saying previously, is I think people might not necessarily know that it's recording all of their information.
Mm.
Like, some of these more insecure AI tools may or may not be recording information. And as people are starting to realize, is like even Anthropic, as sort of righteous as their sort of ethos is, they still are mentioning like, oh yeah, we are retraining on information that people have provided to us.
Yeah. Well, so I think that a big thing over there is that, and I think we as tech people or people who have worked in and around technology and have been technology enthusiasts since we were young. And I think one of the things that we don't appreciate is that we make up a very, very small percentage of the population. And do you remember when the documentary The Social Network, no, not The Social Network, the one that was essentially talking about Facebook and how it's
That was
a,
the social network.
was it The Social Network? The Social
I think so.
Dilemma.
Yes.
The Social Network was the one about the actual Facebook story, and the Social Dilemma was the one about like how it's a privacy nightmare. I think what was really interesting was talking to people who are reasonably smart people, and they'd be like, "Dude, you have to watch The Social Dilemma," and they tell me about the premise of The Social Dilemma, and I'm like, "Yes, that's the that's how they operate." But they were telling it to me like this is an epiphany for them. I'm like, what did you think was going on over there? Like, how do you think Facebook was making all their money? Um, and so that applies to this as well, is that, people who are currently using the free tier of OpenAI or whatever is, as far as we can tell, it's fairly reasonable. It's not being monetized except for in the way of trying to get people to upgrade. But that will inevitably change, or it will change for some of them, whether it be Google or XAI or whatever. And the thing is that people won't realize, the vast majority of people won't realize the privacy implications and how important it is to, have this information be protected, um, until someone releases a Netflix series and they're like, Herman, have you watched this documentary? And it's a privacy nightmare. I'm like, yes, yes, it is.
Yeah, I agree, and I think this is where I still will reiterate that in the future I believe that brand will still be something that matters,
Completely.
because in the same way that Apple, I mean, you don't quite know because Apple obviously advocates for privacy, but where they draw the line on that is quite a murky topic. I think it will still sort of divulge into that because it's not really feasible to ask every single user of an AI tool to validate the security credentials of those tools or to check that it's not retraining on your information. And so people will proxy that to like, oh, I just use OpenAI, they've got a good, or I use Claude because of, they've got this whole
Mm.
sort of anti security mindset. But then again, you also end up into that sort of world garden where you could potentially have bias inside the models and you don't have this opportunity to switch between the two. And maybe it might just be that you have to move everything locally and you just have your own server in your own house that you run all your AI queries on.
And I think that,
Um,
that'll actually be fairly reasonable. But again, that'll be used by like you and I. The broader
mm,
population will still use the free online services. Um, but to sort of round this up and take it a little bit closer to home is one of the things I've noticed while trying out vibe coding for the first time is that this is definitively the direction that software engineering is going. Right now, we call it vibe coding. In a couple of years, it'll just be coding, right?
mm,
And there's a part of me that is actually very sad about this because I've spent so much of my life kind of like honing my skills as a software developer and thinking very hard about this. And also, sometimes you're stuck with a hard problem and it's really tough, and then you beat it and it's very satisfying. You build something and it's satisfying. And so just building these two small tools with AI recently is like they're useful tools, don't misunderstand me. But I didn't get any satisfaction out of building them. They just, like because I didn't build them. I just said it would be very nice if I had a tool like this and I had a tool like that. And so I can't help but think that something will be lost, specifically for me, uh, while we go through this AI revolution. And I don't necessarily think it's for the worst, per se. It's just kind of sad.
yeah, and as the AI coding tools become more prevalent, I feel like this is the productization of the internet and the sort of commercialization of everything. With the early internet, it was about like people creating really cool stuff and spending hours and hours like creating, a game that really people enjoyed, and you kind of saw the value and the beauty in that product because someone had taken the effort to like craft it in a specific way. And now these days, I think this has been taken over by just productivity for whatever sake necessary. And it goes to kind of a bit of a thesis that I have is that AI helps you build features and not products. It's more like it'll get you your clock app, it'll get you your productivity tool, it'll help you calculate this thing or whatever, but it won't create something that's really that you feel like there's like a element of quality in it. And maybe it will get to a point where it is, but I feel when you have an AI tool, you also like tending to build for an outcome, right? You're like, I just want to build, something that gets this task done and it does this thing, but it's not really anything that's like beauty or something that's new or something that's exciting. Like we are seeing it when we've spoken about it on the podcast, but some of these like cool like games that pop up or like these little like internet experiments that are quite cool and unique. But I don't think, yeah, as you said, it doesn't have that same feeling. It's just going to be, oh, everything's like AI crap that you're just like interacting with.
Yeah, it's like I don't think I've ever read any, let's take for instance, AI generated text and been like, that was a good read. Instead, it provided some information fairly factually. I think I'm also on the other end of the spectrum over there in that I review lots of blogs each day. And, I'm seeing more and more AI slop. And so I'm blocking all of those blogs, but it's like I've just got an eye. I can look at a post and I can just see the structure of it. I don't even have to read the words. I can see the structure of it. And I'm like, definitely AI. Yeah, one of the interesting the ones that has kind of like popped up for me is I've started seeing a suspicious amount of like M and N dashes, whereas most people just type with hyphens. And so I'm seeing all these M and N dashes anywhere, and the M and N dashes are used like structurally correctly in English. I'm like, no one knows how to use those properly. I don't even know how to use those properly. Uh,
Yeah, but I think also going back to the other point you had about coding not being as satisfying, uh, it would be quite sad to lose that knowledge, and I feel like that's becoming more of a problem in the AI age. Is you're getting this phenomenon where people are forgetting how to think, or they're not knowing how to think. Like I've seen a couple of articles in some magazines and blogs and stuff where it's like people at universities are just so used to just copy pasting and getting like an essay that pops out, that they're kind of losing that ability to think. And I get the same with cursor too, because like there's a thing in your brain where, like for instance, it's impossible to look at a word and not read the word if you know how like if it's an English word and it comes up on the screen, like it's impossible to like block yourself from reading it. And so as you're coding along, this thing will come up and suggest this thing. And so now I'm primed, like, oh, maybe this is the way that I should be coding this, whereas before I was thinking it as a different way. And so I'm creating this like doubt in a sense, whereas like, oh, maybe I should have used this construct or use this different way or use a class instead of a function. And so it's almost like I'm losing this ability to think about the code. And for sometimes I just like turn it off because I just want to actually think through the stuff, and
yeah.
especially for HTML layouts.
There's a very good example of that exists already, and that is Google Maps. Is that historically people would have a very good idea of where everything was in their city, and they'd know how to reason about driving around or walking around. Whereas I'll meet people who have been in a city for 10 years and they still use Google Maps to like get to their friend's house that they've been to like 4 or 5 times before. And it's like, you should reasonably know how to get to this person's place, but that part of their brain has just been turned off. Like, you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to think about how to get to places. And in a way, you like lose that spatial memory. There was that interesting study with like the London cabbies where they actually had a larger prefrontal cortex, I believe, because they were storing so much extra spatial information. And so I think you're absolutely right. But I think the problems with AI in education are a whole other shebang that we'll have to do an
Yeah.
entire episode on.
It's important that people don't lose that. And part of, I mean, maybe more into a conspiratorial, like doomer mentality kind of view is that if we do have just like a few AI tools that exist, and you have the likes of like the head of Nvidia saying, "Don't learn to code, don't learn to like think." I feel like it's gonna get to this dystopian world where it's like only AI will be able to think things, and we will just be using AI to do everything, and we won't have this sort of thing that makes us human, where we can, you know, reason about things and question things. And so I think that's going to end up being quite a bad outcome if we're not careful.
I think one way to counter that, to end on a light note instead of a completely
Yeah,
doomery note, is to actively engage in the things that you find enjoyable. So if you enjoy coding, like actively engage in coding. Don't hand it all off. I think it's kind of like right now you can buy furniture from IKEA or from Game or wherever, and we've lost the ability to make our own furniture, or actually more close to home. Our parents, or especially our grandparents' generation, they predominantly sewed their own clothes, right? But now you can get incredibly inexpensive clothes from H&M, right off the peg. And so we're started sort of seeing a renaissance of people getting back into sewing because of the enjoyable process of making something from nothing. And so I believe we're able to bring that back and to really get into it, and not lose it. But for the vast majority of people, they're going to go to H&M.
yeah, yeah. And I see it in the tech world. It's like people are finding out how to install PHP on a server. It's
Yeah.
like people are so used to these tools that just automatic to deploy your thing, that people are like, oh, I'm just gonna have like a small VPS and I'm gonna SSH into it, and then they get in there and they're like, how do I actually install all this stuff?
I mean,
And so
like
it's yeah.
I actually took a bit of a hiatus from doing VPS stuff. I had been using Heroku for all of my projects, and I last year went and got myself a nice chunky VPS and went and set up everything. Spent a lot of time SSHing around. I'm like, this is enjoyable. I wrote a bunch of Bash scripts. I got a
Yeah.
lot wrong, but it was good fun.
But I think as long as we start to use the technology, and I think people will adapt to it, but I do think there's got to be a little sort of sense of caution as we go. I don't want to stop the progress of AI. I think there's amazing things happening with it, but I think having a good sense of skepticism and uh, just worrying a little bit about some of these things will mean that we have a better outcome.
Completely, completely.